It was when I saw the blood pouring from her ears that I first realized that something was truly wrong. If you're going to look for evidence of ghosts, to listen for the whispers, or perhaps the screams of the dead, then an abandoned hospital would seem to be the perfect place. Years ago, people used to say that you were more likely to die if you went into a hospital than you were going onto a battlefield. Even today, the vast majority of people who pass away in the developed world do so in a hospital bed, surrounded by bleeping machinery and listening to the muttered incantations of doctors and nurses. Whilst people often think of graveyards as being the places of the dead, if you want to find a place where human beings really experience death, where they actually come face to face with their own mortality and greet the reaper head-on, it's not in a place with headstones, it's within the whitewashed walls and sanitized halls of a hospital building. It's for that reason that a lot of people find hospitals creepy, either because of the association with death, pain and illness, or because the buildings themselves are just a little too austere, too unfeeling and clinical. For a lot of folks, there is something about the lingering stench of disinfectant, the way the wards are always just a little too warm, or how the polished floors of the corridors echo a little too loudly, that makes even the healthy nervous. For Nanny White, though, it was exactly those echoes that were supposed to be the attraction. I first met Nanny White early in my career whilst working for a local television station as a part of the remote camera crew. She was what might generously be referred to as a television psychic. I've changed the name to protect her identity, but if you look up television psychics in the southern states of the US in the late 1990s, you'll be able to figure out who I'm talking about, particularly if you look up those with careers that ended abruptly. Basically, she was one of those women who came on TV and talked about being able to speak to the dead. She would give the typical responses to the audience. Someone with a name starting with a J, or does anyone here have a fatherly figure who passed away recently? The sort of questions guaranteed to get a response. Then she would tell them general things that they wanted to hear. He's happy, or he'd be proud of you, that sort of thing. Until we did the show at the abandoned hospital, I always thought she was pretty much a fraud. When we went there, though, my opinion changed pretty quickly. Until that night, I had never had a problem with hospitals. I mean, I never thought they were fun places to hang out, but they didn't bother me the way that they did some other people. This place was different. The hospital itself had closed years earlier, and though all the drugs and medicines had been removed, a lot of the incidental furniture and even some of the equipment was still there. In some rooms, the beds, on old-fashioned iron frames, and the upright stands that the drips would have hung from were still in place. Cabinets filled with metal bedpans, and in some cases trays that instruments might have laid upon were just left for time to claim. The place had closed about 15 years earlier, but prior to that, had been one of the main hospitals, serving a large clutch of towns in the surrounding area for almost 50 years. Plenty of people in my parents' generation had been born there, which of course also meant that plenty of people had died there too. Our job that day was to film Nanny wafting around and playing pretend at trying to contact some of those people who had died, trying to tune into their frequencies and make contact with those on the other side. We set up shots of her walking in dramatic, moody-looking lighting, up and down the corridors, took B-roll of her staring wistfully out of the windows and rubbing her temples with her eyes closed, as if she was attempting to communicate with someone. It was all utter nonsense, obviously, but it looked good on camera and suitably creepy, especially since the walls had been overtaken with creeping ivy and thick patches of nasty-looking black mold. Having been there a few hours, I was convinced that we'd taken enough footage and was getting ready to pack up for the night, with the intention of coming back the following day to film Nanny doing her actual communing with the spirits. I had just put the main camera into the bag when I heard a horrible, high-pitched screaming coming from a room at the end of the corridor. I ran toward the room, past long empty beds and empty cabinets once full with documents, and found Nanny on her knees. She had blood pouring from both ears so that it spilled onto the shoulders and chest of her white dress and caught in her blonde hair. She looked as if she'd been in a car accident and would not stop screaming. With the help of another guy on the team, I took her by the arm and managed to guide her out of the building and onto the lawn outside, asking over and over as I did, "What happened? What happened?" It was only after around 5 minutes, sitting quiet and blood-soaked on the lawn, that Nanny finally answered. When she did, she looked up at me with such a look of despair, of utter wide-eyed terror, that I have never forgotten it. In a tiny, almost whispered voice, she said, "They all screamed at once, all of them, shouting to be heard. They all screamed at once." A few years later, the hospital building was bulldozed to the ground. Nanny never appeared on television again. From what I hear, it wasn't long before she ended up in a hospital of her own, on a secure ward for the psychologically disturbed. According to her, once they realized she could really hear them, the voices never stopped. All of them screaming at once. Okay, I'm not going to BS you. We knew the place was haunted, or at least we'd heard that it was. I know with a lot of stories about abandoned places, the person talking says that they were unaware, that they went into the creepy old abandoned place like a church or an old barn or something just to explore, and then all of a sudden, out of nowhere, something really weird or terrifying happened, as if they had no idea, and couldn't have guessed that the creepy old haunted house where 5 people died might be actually haunted. Well, it wasn't like that with us. We knew damn well that the place was supposed to be haunted, and to be honest, that's why we went there. The Marston Victorian Baths is an old building on the outskirts of where the new town is, but virtually in the centre of where the town would have been around 100 years ago, in the area now called Old Marston. Go figure. Back when it was open, it was a public school swimming baths, basically a huge old pool of around 30 meters length, in the centre with the wooden cubicles or cabins along either side where people used to get changed and store their stuff. The building itself was brick and tile, and the roof was a huge steel construction with glass panels, so if you were in the pool, you would see the sky above you. The baths closed in the 80s because they were old and out of step with modern times, not having proper changing rooms for one thing. Another public swimming bath with modern pools, slides and even a whirlpool area called the Rapids opened within a mile of the place, and the Victorian Baths building basically just got left to rot. Now, whether the stories about the hauntings came whilst the place was open or were only made up after and projected back, I don't know, but basically the story went that over the years several kids had drowned in that pool, whereas that might be enough to shut a place down nowadays. You have to remember that this place opened in the 1880s, so there would be a story in the paper, a service held to remember the kid, but the pool itself would be open a few days later. There were even rumours that a kid drowned there in the 50s and another in the 60s. There was definitely one in the 70s because I've seen the newspaper clippings about that one. Basically, the pool took one kid every 10 years. The other part of the story was that in the dying days of the pool being open, they ran something called night swims to try and increase business. People could go after work, and the place was kept open until around 1 a.m. for folks to go have a quiet swim. This actually went down quite well, and a lot of people went to these night swims, until one guy reported that while swimming alone one night, he felt someone from under the water grab his ankle and try to pull him under. Again, this isn't made up, it happened in the early 80s, and you can find this in the local papers from the time if you bother to look it up. He said there were loads of hands, with tiny fingers, pulling at him and trying to drag him under. He said that he had to fight really hard and make it to the edge of the pool to stop himself from drowning. That was the story anyway. Now, obviously, me and my mates weren't planning on going for a dip in some old abandoned pool when we decided to break into the place. And even if we were that stupid, the pool had been drained years ago, so it was just a big empty tiled box at the time. We basically went in because we'd heard it was haunted, and it sounded like a creepy thing to do on Halloween. We were just going for a walk around to scare each other, if I'm honest. We had a torch each, broke through one of the boarded up doors at the back, and within about 5 minutes we were in there. The first thing that hit me when I went in was the fact that the roof had fallen in. All the glass panes on the ceiling had fallen through and into the pool, but some were still up there, which scared me because I worried what would happen if a pane of glass fell now. The second thing was the fact that the pool was far from empty. Instead, it was half full, not to mention frozen. With the roof fallen in, the pool had been open to the elements. It had filled with rainwater, snow and leaves and hadn't drained, so it had kept filling up. This being almost November in England, it was absolutely freezing, and the water that was in there, filthy brown and murky as it was frozen solid. At one point, one of my mates suggested that we might be able to stand on, or even run across it, which I knew straight away was a bad idea, especially when I looked down. Now again, I won't bullshit you. I still wonder to this day if what I saw was some kind of trick of the light or a reflection or something, but I don't think so. Looking into the water, into the layer of ice right across the top, I saw a boy, no older than me, under the ice. He was looking up, eyes and mouth wide open as if he was screaming. His skin was the same colour as the tiles around, a sort of greyish blue, and his lips were a deep bruised purple, as if he had been dead a long time. He was wearing nothing but a pair of old-fashioned red swimming trunks, and he was frozen in place, in a weird, grasping position, as if he was trying to claw back up to the surface. I screamed, dropped the torch, and without thinking, ran for my life, leaving my friends to wonder what had gotten into me. As I say, for years I wondered if I'd imagined it, if it was just some sort of illusion, but it wasn't. A few years ago, I met up with one of my old mates from that time, and after way too many drinks, brought up that night with him. He suddenly went very quiet, and then made me promise that if he spoke about it, I'd never bring it up again. Eventually, he said that after I left that night, he and his brother had looked into the water, thinking that I was just trying to scare them. Not only did they see the exact thing that I saw, but they saw more. According to him, they were all there. All 10 of them, mate. All 10 of the kids who died, just frozen in place in the water, leaves and litter and stuff coming out of their mouths, like they were in suspended animation or something. I never did ask him about it again. The weirdest thing is, the Victorian baths aren't abandoned anymore. A grant from the government means that they are now being restored and will actually reopen as a fully functioning pool sometime next spring. I can tell you right now, I will not be going.